Well, good morning, everyone. If you're like me, Lent may have snuck up on you this year. Actually, it's not so much that Lent has taken me by surprise. It's really that all the other seasons have just seemed like Lent. Uh, Epiphany, Christmas, Advent, Pentecost, and what follows, these have all been a lot more Lenten, a lot more self-denial, doing without, somber, darker. Lent may be the undertone for the whole year. Given that, you may not have fixed any firm Lenten disciplines yet. And if that's so, our psalm for today may provide a framework for discerning what you might do this Lent. That's because so many of the verses in this psalm speak about our lives as journeys or pilgrimages, and that's certainly a very Lenten theme. Any new Lenten discipline can be taken up with an eye toward enhancing our progress down the paths of the Lord. Now, verse 4 of the psalm begins with a request or a plea. Make me to know your paths, O Lord. Teach me your ways. That request presumes what's clearly true for anyone who thinks of their life as a journey. That is, that there are lots of possible ways to go. Which way should I go? The psalmist wants to know which paths are God's paths. Well, the next verse makes it clear that God's paths lead to truth. They are the way of salvation. Here's what verse 5 says. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I wait all day long. That's a pretty daring invitation. A pilgrimage down God's paths is a movement into truth. Moving down God's paths commits us to a process of shedding the falsehoods, the evasions, the misperceptions, and misunderstandings that so often shape and maybe even distort the course of our lives. That can be hard, certainly can be scary. We may not want to look that closely at ourselves, but Lent is exactly a time for self-examination. And if we invite God to lead us into truth, we will begin to see ourselves as God sees us and to see others as God sees them. And that may seem scary, but the psalm gives us several points of consolation along this way. Listen again. Be mindful of your mercy, O Lord, and your steadfast love, for they have been from of old. Do not remember the sins of my youth or my transgressions. According to your steadfast love, remember me. For your goodness' sake, O Lord. Good and upright is the Lord. Therefore, he instructs sinners in the way. Failing, faltering along these paths, those are all genuine possibilities. And in response to this, the psalmist reminds us that God is full of mercy. God's love is steadfast. God both knows and recognizes our failures, but that does not stop God from being willing to lead us and teach us. More importantly, whatever we find out about ourselves as we move down God's paths, we can be certain that God will never stop loving us. The God who leads us into all truth showers us with love, making that truth bearable, redeemable, and ultimately life-giving. If we're willing to walk down God's paths this Lent, we will arrive at the same recognition the psalmist does at the end of the psalm. All the paths of the Lord are steadfast love and faithfulness for those who keep his covenant and his decrees. Two final observations here. First, all the paths of the Lord will bring us deeper into God's steadfast love and faithfulness. Regardless of the truth that God teaches us this Lent, the end point is always God's steadfast love. Secondly, throughout this passage, the psalmist refers to paths or the ways of the Lord using the plural. And I take it that this means that the path that God has for each of us is distinctive, made just for us, like a perfectly fitting set of clothes. I don't have to walk this path in somebody else's shoes. God has provided me with a pair that is perfect for me. But the great thing about the path the Lord has set out for me is that it intersects and runs alongside so many other paths. And I think that the more I become used to these clothes, to this pair of shoes, the better able I am to appreciate the clothing, shoes, and ultimately the path God is taking me down, the more I'll be able to appreciate the path God is taking others down as well. Amen.